Good evening, the audience of Conflict and Resilience Research Institute Canada. I welcome on behalf of the Institute to all of you to our 20th episode of the webinar titled From Conflict to Resilience Myanmar and the Opportunity for a More Positive Peace. Thank you once again for making time to join this conversation. The audience, over the past year, Myanmar has experienced one of the sharpest regional deteriorations in peacefulness. According to the Institute for Economics and Peace Global Peace Index of 2025, Myanmar remains the least peaceful country in the Asia Pacific, with declines across the core domains of societal safety and security, ongoing conflict, and, of course, militarization. This is part of a broader global picture, but the Myanmar case is specifically acute. Conflict dynamics are being reshaped by terrain, technology, and transnational illicit economies. Armed actors have increasingly incorporated weaponized drones into asymmetric operations, accelerating the tempo and reach of attacks. Independent analysis documents substantial growth in drone use by both military and resistance force in Myanmar, including strikes across dozens of locations, especially in the peripheral areas. The audience, at the same time, synthetic drug production and trafficking centered in and around Myanmar's borderlands continue to expand, fueling criminality, corruption, and armed financing. Recent United Nations Office of Drug Control reports highlights record regional methamphetamine seizures and sustained industrial scale manufacture in the Golden Triangle area. Today's session is about moving from negative peace, merely the absence of open violence, towards positive peace, the attitude, institutions, and structures that make societies resilient. Institute for Economics and Peace Positive Peace Framework identifies eight interdependent pillars that correlate with long term stability and faster recovery from shocks. We will use that lens to think systematically beyond single issue or positions about what it would take to bend Myanmar's trajectory toward a more durable peace. The latest Global Peace Index also sets out nine conflict escalation factors, from external military support and logistics to ethnic exclusion and conflict instrumentalization, that help explain why certain wars intensify so rapidly. Myanmar exemplifies several of these drivers, and surfacing and addressing them explicitly is essential if we want diplomatic, humanitarian, and track to efforts to land. Our work at the Institute is organized around that same conviction. Through our Global Affairs Canada supported initiative titled Charting a Path to Lasting Peace in Myanmar, we are convening research, dialogue, and innovation, ranging from expert webinars to structured negotiation simulations to test practical pathways out of protracted violence. Many of you have followed our project's updates, knowledge hub posts, and events, and today's webinar continues in that series. We'll ask three guiding questions as we proceed. What does a minimally viable roadmap to positive peace in Myanmar look like in a couple of years now onwards? How can evidence, Global Peace Index, and other data sets inform sequencing, ceasefire mechanics, humanitarian corridors, justice integration, and economic recovery? And finally, where can technology and negotiation tools, for example, Smart Settle for multi party bargaining, help unlock impasses while remaining conflict sensitive and inclusive? The audience, we have invited a very important person today, and it's now my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Michael Collins, who is the Executive Director for the Americas at the Institute for Economics and Peace, and he's based out of New York. Michael is leading the think tank dedicated to developing metrics to analyze peace and to quantify its economic value. Leveraging private sector and almost 20 years of humanitarian and development experience, he is responsible for expanding IEP's impact, including the adoption of positive peace as an evidence and systems based tool for effective peace centered development. Michael, thank you very much for joining us and for bringing IEP into the discussions. We very much look forward to listen intently what you suggest we should think maybe a little differently out of the box. So without further ado, let me also uh, share with you that, dear audience, we have David Newman, our founder, director, and our core member, Dr. Ernest Thyssen, also in presence. And the way we'll conduct, we'll let Michael speak uninterruptedly in the beginning, and then we'll do our regular question and answer session. Without further ado, Michael, floor is yours, sir. Go ahead.
Excellent. Thank you very much for this invitation, Kauser, and everyone. It's a wonderful opportunity. We actually come to the table with a lot of the same questions, right? But hopefully we can definitely help unpack it more, perhaps positioning Myanmar within sort of global context. You mentioned that it was the 20th, episode of the webinar, which would, you'd think that it would be more celebratory, but of course, with everything happening around the world, it's very difficult to celebrate, right? And unfortunately, today is going to be about unpacking that a tiny bit more, again, to the extent that we can, sort of putting Myanmar essentially in context. So let me just go ahead and share my screen. And thank you again very much for the introduction to IEP. So we're a nonprofit, essentially. We're a think tank. We're based out of Sydney, Australia. I run IEP's New York office. We have engagements, of course, throughout the US, the Western Hemisphere, and in the United Nations here in New York as well. I don't have any direct working experience in Myanmar, but invariably a lot of the people on the call today do. So please fill in the blanks. And starting with, how do we actually measure peacefulness in the first place? The basis really for the creation of the Institute, was this fact that we couldn't really measure peace. Peace has traditionally been considered something sort of amorphous, kind of difficult to measure. How do we even start? But then the premise of that to a degree is, well, if we can't really measure changes in peace very, very specifically, how do we know whether what we are trying to put in place or have put in place is actually, being successful or not? And there are, of course, very direct things that we can immediately measure, right? We can measure violent crime, we can measure homicide, but that in itself is actually incredibly challenging around the world. There are lots of different countries that collect quite a bit of data, right? But many countries where all of these elements, violent demonstrations, terrorism, are incredibly, incredibly underreported. So it can actually be a significant challenge to develop a measure, even for those more superficial aspects of peace. The important thing for us was to start with kind of sort of a very superficial description of peace, right? What are the first things that we can capture to better understand whether peacefulness is increasing globally or in Myanmar, right, for that matter? So we start with this definition, the one that you see here in front of you: the absence of violence or fear of violence. So the way that we look at it, and Kauza, thank you again for referring very quickly to the Global Peace Index, which is our flagship report, is number one, we look at instances of conflict around the world, right? Including conflict deaths, how long conflicts have been going on, the intensity of that conflict. Then we look also at internal measures within countries as well. The Global Peace Index covers 163 countries around the world. So I mentioned a few of those indicators before, things like availability of small arms, internal displacement, political terror, all factor within this safety and security domain here. And then again, you noted the third domain in this case, which is militarization. Now, we really don't place any moral judgment on any of this, but the premise is that the most peaceful country would have no conflict, would have no crime, and would have no need for high levels of militarization, right? Because it would be a country that is at peace. So, of course, unfortunately, none of these countries exist, but it does nonetheless provide a good benchmark to be able to compare where different countries currently score in their overall levels of peacefulness. So we use 23 different indicators. These are all sourced from reputable sources around the world. We bring those together and band them into a composite score, which kind of allows us to do some relatively cool stuff. For example, be quite specific as to whether the world is becoming more or less peaceful. So perhaps unsurprisingly, it became less peaceful last year. This is the 6th consecutive year of deterioration. This is the least peaceful that we have been since the Global Peace Index started in 2008. So evidently the world is going through significant trouble. Over 100 countries are less peaceful today than they were back in 2008. The 25 most peaceful countries have all deteriorated in peacefulness over the last decade. Taking all of those different numbers that I mentioned before and sort of plugging them into a visual map, this is what we would see. So the MENA region continues to be the less peaceful, and has been for quite some time. Europe is currently the most peaceful, but has deteriorated in peacefulness last year. Asia Pacific is actually the second most peaceful out of the 7 regions included in the index, but that also deteriorated. In fact, the only region to improve in peacefulness that last year was South America. So the Global Peace Index itself has got, this full ranking of countries, and there's a lot more peaceful countries than the ones that you see here. This is just sort of like the top 10. Japan, Botswana, Bhutan, Argentina has done relatively well recently. Mauritius, Madagascar. The ones on the left here, these are the top 5, actually all deteriorated in peacefulness last year. The ones on the right, pretty much as well. I think Finland remained stagnant. Now, if we go down to that bottom list of countries there, these are the countries that are most affected by conflict. These are the countries most affected by crime, right? That also have very high levels of militarization as well. So perhaps unsurprisingly, at this point, Russia and Ukraine are the 2 least peaceful countries in the world. It's the first time that Russia has been the least peaceful country in the world. Last year, for example, it was Yemen, and the year before that, it was Afghanistan. Hopefully, this kind of sort of points to the fact that we try and remain morally and ethically agnostic, independently of where you lie on the issue of, say, Russia and Ukraine. Both of these countries have been impacted from a peacefulness perspective, evidently, right? If we look at Palestine and Israel, they don't factor in the bottom 10, but they factor in relatively closely. In fact, so does Myanmar. So Myanmar currently ranks 153rd out of 163 countries in the Global Peace Index. We can also sort of look at the biggest improvements around the world as well. Now, just because they're big improvements compared to last year doesn't mean that these are massively peaceful countries, right? So all of these countries rank relatively low in the Global Peace Index, maybe around 100. I think Gambia is the one that ranks the best at around 50, just to give you a sense. And then there are some big deteriorations, of course. In the case of Bangladesh last year, a lot of civil unrest leading to the resignation of Sheikh Hasina. That was unrest before and after. We talked about Ukraine and Russia. Congo, the DRC, one of the largest displacement crises in the world currently, and the largest deterioration actually Myanmar this year, which is the least peaceful country currently in the Asia Pacific region, below North Korea. So this is kind of sort of like panning us out a tiny bit. This is actually looking at that measure of peacefulness since 2008. And as we can see here, pretty much sort of a year-on-year deterioration over time. There's very little good news that we can actually speak of. I guess not that it's a silver lining by any means, but I guess in some ways the situation in Myanmar is not unique, given all of the different conflict and that we're seeing around the world, both in terms of crime, both in terms of political instability, and of course conflict and militarization as well. Militarization is a trend that had been improving for the last decade, and has, that trend has started to shift over the last 2-3 years. One of the things that we found quite fascinating in some of the work this year for the Global Peace Index was what we're now calling these 3 kind of sort of eras. And again, hopefully I can connect to how this influences the situation in Myanmar. So this is kind of sort of the Cold War period. This goes back all the way to 1975, as you can see here. So relatively high levels of fragmentation, at the same time, a certain degree of stability. All of the superpowers hated each other, right? Here we see this kind of what no doubt we're going to look back at as sort of a global age of, so golden age of globalization and multilateralism, right? Decreasing conflict around the world, unifications, much stronger multilateralism, as I mentioned before. And then essentially from, this period here, going from 2008, 2009, a whole bunch of stuff has happened. We can point to multiple things, of course. The advent of, the Internet of Things and everything that goes with it has invariably impacted that. The fact that we're collecting better data today than we were before is another element related to that. And then, of course, there is just the polarization that we are seeing around the world, which we delve into a bit. But as you can see, a massive, massive increase in fragmentation around the world, both financially, mobility-wise, politically, and in trade as well. So if we take this, for example, and we now map it to say levels of conflict, right? Actually, no, that's in a couple of slides. This is actually interesting. Let me just go back one here, right? So here, largely, we're talking about geopolitical influence, and this is the amount of influence that one country has over another. Now, if we go back in time, essentially in this case back to the 90s, and we look at, say, China, Turkey, Australia, and India. Now, Australia, India, and China have very specific interests for Myanmar, perhaps less Turkey, but this is where they stood in terms of geopolitical influence back in the 90s, right? This is where they stand today. So as you can see, these countries, and not only these countries, have become significant players in many of the different conflicts and interests that we're seeing around the world. Of course, a lot of that relates to natural resources. A lot of it can relate to ideology as well. Significant economic elements that influencing that as well. Broader security in the case of Australia, for example, economic development in the case of China. What's the consequence of all of this? Well, just a couple of things. And here's that slide, I believe, that I wanted to show before, which is these are battle deaths around the world. Kind of also going back to this 1975 period, right, the height of the Cold War here. And as we can see, a decrease in conflict around the world, a golden age of conflict, although, of course, still significant deaths around the world. And now we're seeing these spikes, right, parallel to this increase in polarization around that we're seeing, right, and the breakdown of multilateralism. The consequence of a lot of that is we're seeing significantly fewer peace agreements today around the world than we were seeing over the last 50 years. We're seeing significantly less what we say here, one-sided victories, right? Either the victory from a government force or alternatively a non-state actor. War is becoming a lot more asymmetric, and you can evidently see that in Myanmar. And the consequence of all of that is that these conflicts here, right, what we call, I can't quite see my mouse, here we are. These conflicts here, right, these low activity conflicts, the number of those has significantly increased around the world. A lot more conflicts continue to exist that may not be significant today, but are nonetheless uncured. And can flare up at any individual time. So thank you, Kauza, for mentioning kind of sort of some of those core factors that lead to this flaring up of conflicts that exist around today. Although I'd perhaps like to prefer to use the latter part of my talk to talk a bit about positive peace. So that's kind of in many ways the challenge facing us today. Specifically in the case of Myanmar, I mean, it has been in the headlines, evidently, but by no means as much as it perhaps should. And the same applies for many other conflicts around the world. So, from a media perspective, interstate conflicts, right? War or conflict between two states, Israel and Palestine, Russia, Ukraine garners significant more coverage. So in the case of Myanmar here, we'll be talking as an internationalized interstate conflict, which actually receives the lowest levels of publicity. Now, whether that makes it more or easier to resolve the conflict, I don't quite know. I'd very much leave that up to the experts there. Perhaps ending on the economic impact of violence. So we calculated on an annual basis for the Global Peace Index over $19 trillion in purchase power parity in 2024. And just very quickly, the numbers for Myanmar, economic cost of violence 2024, we calculated at 44 billion, right? Essentially over 15% of the country's GDP. Now that is very significant. Peaceful countries see the cost of violence being about 3%. Unpeaceful countries, on average, see it as, the worst ones up to 33%. On occasions, we see up to 60%. In the worst days of Syria, the conflict in Syria, for example, hitting, an economic hit of 60% of the country's GDP. Absolutely significant. Very, very quite similar in the Ukraine. So, war produces a significant hit. I don't think that is rocket science. I think that we kind of get it. And this brings us to the question of, well, what can we do about it? And this is where I'd like to just take a few minutes, if you'll allow me, to introduce the concept of positive peace and to see how it could be applied in the concept of Myanmar. So until now, we've kind of sort of talked about this area of negative peace, which is the absence of violence or fear of violence, some of these superficial measures that we talked about before. One of the exercises that we've done is to then try and see what that tells us about what we can do socioeconomically and from a perspective of attitudes, institutionally, structurally within our societies, to build peacefulness, right? To reduce crime, to reduce conflict, to reduce militarization. So we do and have done over the last 15 years statistical analysis to be able to better understand what are the attitudes, institutions, and structures that statistically correlate with improvements in negative peace, right? Improvements in peacefulness, lower levels of crime, lower levels of conflict, etc. So this is where some of our research, specifically the Positive Peace Report, comes in. It basically started by looking at over 25,000, by now almost 50,000 different data sets that we could get our hands from around the world, development data sets, political data sets, opinion polls, qualitative surveys, basically anything that we could find on, throw it against the Global Peace Index and see if it sticks, to see if there is a correlation there. Through other forms of statistical clumping and regressional analysis, we're then able to kind of sort of isolate some of these stronger factors. And we use 24 of those on an annual basis for the Positive Peace Report. But really, for the purpose of application, we actually sort of simplify that even more. And we talk about these 8 pillars that you so kindly referred to, Kauza, before, which we call the 8 pillars of positive peace. And this kind of sort of really distills some of these core elements that correlate with these improvements in peacefulness and produce the economic benefits that we were talking about before. I'm not going to go through them pretty one. Hopefully, they're relatively intuitive here, as you can see here. And the interesting thing here is that we look at this from the perspective of the nation state, because that's where there is the most data available. But, really, this applies in any size context, right? And you can look at this at the community level. You can look at this at the municipality level. You can look at this within any social system. You could look at it within a school, for example, right? Or you look at it within a village, or even potentially within an organization as well. Now, the idea in a way, by sort of simplifying this complex analysis into what is hopefully relatively simple pillars here, is that it kind of sort of allows for contextualization, but it also brings in the heaviness and the gravitas of the data, right? What does the data also tell us? Well, it tells us, for example, that all of these pillars are interdependent. As and when a country makes a shift in one of these pillars, it has an impact on the other pillars of positive peace. Now, sometimes that can be positive, sometimes it can be negative. So one of the core aspects here, when we are thinking about development, when we're thinking alternatively about peace agreements, right, and especially in the longer term, is how is this particular policy, this particular aspect that I'm including, is going to feed in or influence the other pillars as well. One of the other things that the data tells us is that nudges are best. When you try and make a shift in one major pillar, it can have distinctly a negative consequence on other ones. So by making small improvements across the board, you're a lot less likely to make mistakes and a lot more likely to move the system to a high level of peacefulness over time. Now, it's not a silver bullet, evidently, right? In the case of Myanmar, we can't start building positive peace tomorrow. There needs to be a ceasefire first, right? And all of these things do take a considerable amount of time. But that doesn't mean that there isn't stuff that we can't start doing, and it doesn't mean that there isn't stuff that we can't already take into account when it comes to developing ceasefires and negotiated agreements. One of the silver linings of this kind of slower process is that momentum really matters. What do we mean by that? That as and when you build positive peace, it actually becomes easier and easier. So this is why we often talk about countries caught in the conflict trap, or alternatively caught in a virtuous cycle, right? Because it becomes easier and easier. You now have the basis to be able to build peacefulness over time. Now, what does this specifically mean for Myanmar? Well, I mentioned at the beginning that I wasn't an expert in Myanmar, and this is really a question for all of us here and for the people of Myanmar is, well, what does it mean to you? What do you interpret as free flow of information in your context? What is important to you, and what are the things that we need to discuss from either party to be able to make sure that we're meeting our joint goals in that particular area. One of the benefits of positive peace in many ways, and some of the mediated processes that we've used this for, is that it kind of moves away from conflict prevention or do no harm, which is identifying a conflict and then identifying the parties and then dividing and then finding the greatest instance of conflict and working on that. And it kind of sort of broadens it out and smooths it out, and it provides a menu of options, right, in a very similar way to something that Smart Settle does. And oftentimes those aren't pointed options either, right? It isn't about relinquishing power. It isn't about deciding how many people would have access to government. It isn't deciding, what the security forces are going to do and who's going to be integrating. It can start much broader than that and build those bases so that those more sensitive aspects can be touched on later. This is just one example, right? So this is a photo of reintegrated members of the FARC, the guerrilla forces in Colombia, working with victims of the Colombian conflict to help build positive peace in an extremely local context. In this case, a village called Algeciras in Colombia, and using these pillars in an extremely broad way. What score would we give to our town here in each of these individual pillars, and enabling the conversation that way, right? What would we choose to focus on? Have we deteriorated or become better in some of these different pillars? Now, as it happens, Myanmar, when we look at the data, is also extremely low in positive peace, right? So even if there is peace today, which is going to be incredibly important, there is going to be a lot of work to do. But again, this speaks to the need to really start focusing on these particular aspects early on, and also to point to the economic benefit of those. So I don't have the immediate numbers in front of me, but countries that improve in positive peace see significant economic benefits, right? Significantly higher foreign direct investment, lower volatility, lower interest rates, 2 times higher GDP growth than countries deteriorating in positive peace, and even more benefits as they progress up the spectrum. So I think, in the interest of time, and I'd really love to be able to hear the team's thoughts on this, specifically in terms of how this could apply in the context of Myanmar. I'm going to hand it back to you. Let me leave you with one thought. Oftentimes I use this framework as well as many others to try and think my way around the world, and just to give an example of how I would apply something like this, and how conceivably you can use tools like Smart Settle, is if I was invited to be a mayor of a city or a country for that matter, right, or the president of a country that I had never ever been to before, right, and I desperately needed to learn very quickly, and I wanted to do it in a good way, and I wanted to make sure that I was implementing the right kind of policy, this framework would provide me with kind of sort of like a guiding sense of the things that I can generally focus on and the people that I should be speaking to. So really, it's no more or no less than that, right? It is just a broad guiding framework to be able to inform the conversation. So context is king. And of course, fundamentally, this is always going to come down to the people of Myanmar and those of you who are very generously working on negotiated settlement. So I'll leave it there, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Michael. What a wonderful presentation with the numbers, and this is important for our audience, because oftentimes we lose sight of the numbers and how economics guides peace in everyday context. Thank you so much, Michael, once again from the institute. Folks, we are going to engage in a bit of question and answer session, and especially I'm very interested to bring David now into the discussion, because David is an ardent and very vocal supporter of positive peace, and most of the time of my life I'm with David. This is what he preaches always. So David, why don't you go ahead and have your question, but I would only request that try to see how we are thinking about doing this in Myanmar. Go ahead, David.
I'm going to leave most of the time for this to Ernest, who is actually producing not only the technology, but has been through an amazing learning process himself from one of the students of Positive Peace who became an ambassador. That's Maria Cristina Chuentes from Colombia. But I did want to say that going back to 1997 to 99, I was a minister responsible for over 51 Northern Affairs communities in Manitoba that had informal, evolving, effectively self-government, local government. And the goal of legislation of 1970 was that they would become incorporated municipalities, like as part of southern Manitoba. And so you know, the north of Manitoba, consisting of then about 70,000 people, was 80% of the geography of the province, okay? So, and most of those communities were either mixed blood, Métis peoples, or First Nation peoples, and all of them, the largest communities around them, with a few exceptions of northern industrial cities, were First Nations, very large First Nations. So the exercise when I came in was to see that after 27 years, not a single community had fulfilled the objectives of the legislation. Not one of them had become an incorporated municipality. And that became the mission for 3 years that I encouraged, inspired, and had my deputy minister lead. After a strategic planning process where everyone in the department bought into it and became the owners of the project. And it was called the Self-Reliance Initiative. And one of the modest goals, speaking to the example you gave about incremental, small steps, small beginnings, was to challenge the communities that wanted to participate in the process, volunteer into the process, was to increase the own source revenue capacity to 10%, 10% of the revenue supporting the community. And I'll just shorten it to say that at the end of the day, the first one, 3 years later, did become incorporated. And now that pattern, 30 years later, has, of course, spiraled and more rapidly successful, self-determined local governments have emerged with self-responsibility. But it was the identification of the obstacles which was most instructive to the civil servants, because they'd always thought of themselves as the people that do the work. They lift them out of poverty. They do the things in the government to help them, rather than focusing on empowerment, on their own ownership of community development. And at the end of the day, it was fascinating because I would meet after every year with now the implementers of the strategic plan, and I would ask the question, okay, how's it going? And the last time when it was obviously they owned it, it was bought, it was measurably progressive, they were in a state of depression. So I asked the leading female voice as to what is going on here. I thought you'd be celebrating. And she said, Mr. Minister, we have now realized we have been doing this wrong for 27 years. And we also now are fearful that we will no longer have a role in the provincial government. And I share this because it's the kind of thing that the central governments of every country, every province, every state might legitimately fear. But the answer was, and here's where the Marshall Plan comes in, the answer was, you're going to get more money from Treasury Board, you're going to get more training, you're going to become educated empowerers of communities, you're going to become community development people, facilitating the assets in the local communities and the cultures of the local communities and so forth. So my own experience, and yesterday at the Rotary Club of Winnipeg, we had a speaker from Kenya who's a community development person, now a Canadian citizen. He's doing community development work in rural Manitoba, even with Indigenous peoples. And this immigrant from and now Canadian citizen is following the same pattern, right? And what I hear you say, and I've heard, of course, many ambassadors and Steve and many others like you speak to Global Peace Index. It seems to me that this is what it really fundamentally is. It is finding ways to allow communities to develop themselves in empowered ways with proper encouragement, support, and of course, central infrastructures that allow it to happen. The most important one being, of course, absence of violent, destructive violence by the military of that very country. So my question from that is that an accurate analogy really for the kinds of things that emerge out of your Global Peace Index and the very now measured progress that you have described very eloquently and very effectively, that's based on data and comparisons, which are very useful in terms of relative progress.
Thanks, David. It's a great question. I mean, maybe just to touch on data, and really it doesn't matter, what data you have. Data is never really going to provide you the answer that you want, right? It's never going to tell you what to do. And I think that is one of the large misunderstandings about data. But it's also understandable. We all want data to solve our problems. The limitation of data, though, but also the benefit is that it informs our work, right? And it helps provide the context. And it can do that in many different ways. It can, in the case of the Global Peace Index, it can help you to better understand that the context of your country or what's going on in the country is not unique. Now, in a way, that may help you understand that there are potentially other countries around the world that can help you, right? And that have been through the same situation and have been through the same path. And the same can apply at the community level as well. So, I definitely say that yes, I think that process that you so aptly described is very much, good stomping ground for positive peace. Again, noting that it's never going to make the decisions for you, but the idea is to make you more comfortable with the decisions that you make.
What was fascinating was the obstacles which were discovered within the provincial government. One of the most significant one was the absence of private land ownership. Or local government land ownership. It was all Crown land, right? So you have a central control. So then breaking down those kinds of barriers. Also, management of things like conservation, forestry, the mining industry, also left out to far greater an extent the Indigenous peoples and values and so forth. So if anything, I brought to the team that Kaiser has put together in the service of the Global Affairs Canada grant is an appreciation that it is more of a learning process. It'll be a mutual learning process for all the Canadians involved and every other country of peoples that are involved in this process. We're learning from the people of Myanmar. We're learning from them. And then we're able to, hopefully, guided by technology and what they have determined themselves at a tier 3 level, track 3 level, can be addressed with the help of more privileged, prosperous, free countries like Canada and Australia and so forth. So I turn it over to Ernest.
Ernest, go ahead. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, okay, thanks, David. So, yeah, Michael, that background was very helpful, and showing Myanmar in that context where it fits. If I remember correctly from what you said, Myanmar is 11th, didn't quite make the top 10, but 11th in the least peaceful countries, and I guess it's been steadily going in that direction, like a bad direction. I imagine it was 5th on the most deterioration that had happened in all of these countries. It was the 5th most deterioration happened in Myanmar, and so I guess I interpret that as it's been in past years it's been farther down on the list, and it's come up to just 11th in the last little while. So that is a sobering statistic. What we're trying to do is no small challenge there in Myanmar. So I think it's always good to see all of those 8 pillars of positive peace in context whenever we're talking about this, not just the absence of violence and the absence of the fear of violence. Although I was thinking that when you talked about like negative peace and positive peace, maybe that absence of violence and the fear of violence could not be characterized as negative, but maybe just a precondition for the other pillars of positive peace. We really need that too, right?
Yeah, absolutely, Ernest. And it's an unfortunate term, and it kind of sort of stems from the field of peace studies, which in itself is relatively nascent compared to a lot of the other sciences. So the term, well, it's debatable who it was coined by. It was definitely used before Galtung, the kind of sort of especially the positive peace nomenclature, but he kind of sort of framed it in these particular terms of negative peace and positive peace. But yeah, despite the name, negative peace is a good thing. It's in fact what we are striving to, right? It's the ideal outcome. The reason that it's called negative peace is simply because it describes the absence of something rather than the presence of something else. And as to it being a precondition, well, it's interesting, right? When there is absolutely no peacefulness, right? Such as the context of Myanmar and some of the other countries that we saw here. In many ways, it is, right? And it can often be until a country is kind of sort of at a mid-tier level of peacefulness when some of the other key pillars start playing a role. But oftentimes that then leads to excessive securitization as well, right? And we mustn't forget that really what does drive improvements in negative peace over the time is precisely improvements in positive peace. So it is really important to kind of acknowledge, the importance of both of these things in tandem. One of the bad things about deteriorating negative peace is that they really take positive peace to the chopping block in many, many ways. And that is, that's unfortunate, because you can have a circumstance in which as a country you've been progressively improving in measures of positive peace over a number of years. You may rank midway in, say, the Global Peace Index from a negative peace perspective, and then for whatever reason you haven't developed yet those levels of resilience that allow you to deal with any particular crisis, right? Be that a disaster, be that a political crisis, and then the conflict that generates from that really takes a hack at levels of positive peace, and they deteriorate very quickly. So what you've built over 20 years can get destroyed within a period of months. So yeah, there's a lot of kind of sort of nuance to that relationship. If you'll allow me to share something quite intriguing, we often talk about countries with what we call a positive peace deficit and a positive peace surplus. And what we do basically is we match a country's global peace index ranking, negative peace, to its positive peace ranking. So you can have a country that has a positive peace surplus, which means that it has quite high levels of, crime and conflict, but from a positive peace perspective, right, it's got all of the tools that it needs to be able to deal with its stuff, right? It's more likely to improve in peacefulness. Now, countries that have a positive peace deficit are countries that are actually scoring, relatively well in something like the Global Peace Index, and they're not in the news, you haven't heard about them, but when you look at the underlying attitudes, institutions, and structures, they're very low and deteriorating. So that is a warning for future deteriorations in negative peace, right? It's a conflict warning. So 87% of the countries that had what we call a positive peace deficit in 2009 deteriorated significantly over the next decade. And that included a whole bunch of countries that we wouldn't have naturally thought of. This was prior to the Arab Spring, for example, right? So we identified Libya, identified Syria. We missed a couple. We missed the Ukraine. I can't remember if we missed Myanmar, probably because of its low levels of positive peace. But that's another way where you can think about the interaction between these two core components.
So I really like the way that you ended your presentation with the goal of helping communities become architects of their own peace. And that's what very much what we're trying to do. We could adopt that goal for our project as well. I like that the way of framing that. And so one thing that we're emphasizing is through facilitating structured dialogue and focusing on how to make progress on these 8 pillars of peace, we're encouraging transformation to happen within the country. And generally transformation takes a while to happen. It doesn't happen overnight, but if some of that can happen even in a small way, just to open the door a little bit wider for peace to happen, it will be great.
Thank you. Thank you, Ernest. May I jump in? We have a couple of minutes left, Michael, to pick your brain on a couple of things I was following when you were speaking about the peace index. So for our audience and for us also, can you tell us which 2 positive peace pillars are currently the most binding constraints, and which one is the easiest near term to unlock?
Wow, that's quite a question, Kauza. In relation to Myanmar specifically or globally?
I mean, globally.
Globally. So, okay, so there's a very interesting phenomenon. Now, we divide, in the Positive Peace Report, we divide, so each of these pillars of positive peace, there were over 500 of these data sets that showed strong correlations with improvements in peacefulness over time. Now, a lot of those have correlations between them and kind of sort of say similar things and the same topically. So we were able to progressively, reduce those essentially to the core ones. And as I mentioned before, we used 24 in the Positive Peace Report. Basically, we use the 3 that have the strongest correlation in each of these different pillars. We also use sort of a cross-sectional, remember we talked about the attitudes, institutions, and structures. So the way that these 24 indicators, we map them to these 3 things: attitudes, institutions, and structures. And some of these are debatable exactly what bucket you could put them in. I mean, the whole point of positive peace is that you can't really put them in any bucket. It's all connected anyway. But one of the things that we have noticed, for example, that is extremely intriguing, and actually we were invited by the UN Human Development Report, to provide an input paper specifically on this topic this year, is that while structures around the world, so while overall poverty, while overall healthy life expectancy, while overall education, for example, right, access to services has increased and improved around the world over the last decade and more, and while generally speaking, from an institution's perspective, right, the way governments work around the world, generally speaking, it has improved. Positive peace generally has a tendency to improve. Institutions haven't improved massively by any means. The attitudes domain has significantly deteriorated. And it really presents a paradox in many ways, right? Because you see things are getting better, generally speaking. Institutions are getting better and their ability to manage it is getting better. But the way that we are treating each other and the way that we are behaving is becoming considerably worse. Now, I mentioned the Internet of Things at the very beginning, and I think that intuitively we'd all agree that that has no doubt had a significant impact, especially if you look at the context of, say, the United States today. But we see this all around the world. So what would the attitudes domain encompass? Well, for example, the acceptance of the rights of others pillar, right? Or the good relations with neighbors pillar. And of course, certain elements from all of those other pillars, because remember that they're all connected there. So I think that there remains a lot of work to be done around how we deal as a humanity with the new world that we have created and now are forced to live in many ways. A lot of that is in relation to technology, evidently, which again, has been around, but it's also very nascent. I can't remember which law it is. What is it? Moore's law, right? Which sort of talks about how technologically advances exponentially over time. And right now we're just struggling to catch up. I think that a lot of that is influenced. A lot of that has generated a lot of the geopolitical imbalance that we're seeing today. Evidently, the more technology, the more capacity, the more growth, the more there is the requirement for natural resources, rare earth minerals. That in itself drives geopolitical competition, which drives security concerns, which then drives increases in militarization, which then in many ways correlates with a lot of the increased conflict we're seeing today.
No, thank you, Michael. What a fascinating insight. And I think I would take your lead and also add that the very recent violence in Nepal, and which actually toppled the government as of yesterday, was triggered by the government's ban on Facebook. And some of you might be knowing that this is how the whole movement of toppling the government actually started. We have one more or two more minutes. Again, a very important thing I really want your insight on it is about pathways and sequencing, which I am very fascinated when I read the report. So in a fragile settings, we tend to understand which one should be done first. So according to your understanding of so many conflicts globally, what is the most plausible order? Ceasefire, humanitarian access, local government compacts, national political roadmap, or you suggest some other things as sequential, because we can't start everything together. And the reason I'm asking you this question, because we will definitely be asked by many watching Myanmar conflict that what you guys are suggesting, there is no ceasefire yet, Michael.
Yeah, absolutely. And, this particular area is of distinct interest to us, but it is also very, very nascent. We're actually going to be producing or publishing the next Positive Peace Report where we delve into this specifically. I mean, we are, again, I mentioned we're a nonprofit, we're a think tank, we have a peace building mission. And ultimately, this needs to end in, okay, well, I'm a country in this particular position, right, in this particular situation rather than position. How can this data inform the policy decisions that I need to take right now, currently where I am with my current level of peacefulness, be that negative peace or positive peace? And how come some of this data assist in that? So we started to do that a bit in the latest Positive Peace Report, and we sort of talked about this mid-tier countries and the importance of the well-functioning government pillar specifically within these kind of sort of what we call mid-peace countries. We don't have a formal response or sequencing, official formal response or sequencing for, for countries throughout that spectrum. I think that this is what we're trying to build on. But really, I think that our answer would be pretty much the same as yours, which is, in these situations, rule of law is key, right? Rule of law, ceasefire provides the space to be able to start to consider how we implement some of these medium to longer term changes that are going to help build positive peace over time, and consequently improve negative peace over time as well. There needs to be something in that space. Interestingly, at the very other end of the spectrum, that rule of law is also one of the first things that kind of breaks down when we see conflict arise in very high peaceful nations as well. So I think rule of law really bookends a lot of this, but not forgetting that the rule of law really can't be implemented unless you understand the implications that has on all of the pillars that we talked about before.
Thank you, David.
Kauser, very quickly, you of course hit on it. I was a lawyer for many years, so and the rule of law is very important to me. And we have a project called Rules of Law on Earth, rulesoflawonearth.org. And I happen to have concluded that is the absolute prioritized need in the sequence. I'm not saying the imposition of rule of law. I'm saying the general acceptance of rules by the peoples affected by rules for coexisting in positive peace. So what is missing in our world, I think, is universal values, which are generally accepted. And what has given me real hope for the first time in a long time is, for example, the definition of the golden rule, as treat others as you want to be treated, including not only fellow humans everywhere, but also nature and also future generations. And I have advocated for years now that the four-way test, when we talk about all concerned in two of the four-way test. Again, if that inclusive of all humans everywhere and nature and future generations, we have a way for survival of the human species. But without that, how can rules be created? So the way that I've tried to deal with this is through sports analogies. I mean, no one wants a soccer game without rules, referees, enforcement, general acceptance of the results, so the game goes on. But we don't have that on a global basis, and we've got resistance because of the desire to control, of course, by the United States leading the way and the other veto power countries. So, do you have any comment to make about that? Because I also have community development people that have told me you never start with values as effectively laying out here's the values, but what you do, you discern what the local values are, and then you can relate them to universal values, right? But anyway, I appreciate your comments on this, because the door is open by Jonathan Granoff and lawyers in New York and World Academy of Arts and Science to this kind of approach, frankly, as a basis for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals.
Ernest, do you want to say something, or I would like to conclude? Yeah.
No, I think it goes without saying, there's two options. You can either say might is right or rule of law, and might is right doesn't work. It just leads to violence.
Thank you. Thank you so much. The audience, we are going to close the session today. What a delight to have Michael with us, and the way he presented a couple of core ideas, and rest of the things, the audience, you can find in their website. really astonishing amount of work that IEP has put in peace building and conceptualizing positive peace. And I would really urge upon to check their reports and study, because it has deep implications. And as I conclude, I would like to go back to Michael and listen to his last words today. Then I'll formally say goodbye. But Michael, you have told us that global peace has declined quite substantially over, and this is the first year possibly we are going through one of the worst years in peacefulness globally. But having all these things said, uh, are you hopeful for the future that we will go from the a positive peace deficiency to surplus? Do you see any silver lining moving forward?
Yes, I wouldn't be in this line of business unless I did, Kausar, for sure, and absolutely. Just today I was reading an article about the fact that the internet is supposedly going to be dead within 10 years because it will all be run by bots talking to each other, which may allow us to be able to sort of return to our primal, living space, basically the world, and to start treating ourselves again with kind of sort of the respect that is due. David referred to values very quickly. I think, you know, um, Thomas Sowell had this very good idea about constrained and unconstrained view, right? Two kind of sort of ways of looking at the world. Either, one is that the systems are bad and we just need to destroy the system, or alternatively that we are bad and we just need to put in place the norms that are just going to help us get better step by step. I probably tend towards this camp, and I think that hopefully we're gradually coming to that realization as well. So hopefully that's going to allow us to be able to develop some of the practical measures. There's probably going to be a few scares along the way, evidently, and there may be some conflict too, but I'm pretty sure we'll pull through.
Thank you, Michael. Like you, we would like to be also very hopeful, because we are in the business, as you rightly mentioned. We talk peace building. The audience, we are going to close the session today. It was absolutely delightful to host Michael today and his institute, economics and for peace. And this is a wonderful organization, and to the best of my knowledge, one in a kind in the world, which actually measures peace. And as Michael started his talk today, that it is often difficult to measure peace. We have many tools to measure the outcome of war and warfulness. And by the way, on a lighter note, you might be also aware that United States of America is changing the name of Pentagon to Department of War. But having said so, my point is, we all strive towards peace, and this is what we are really committed to. And especially our project in Myanmar looks into the core impacts of conflict, and this is why we are looking for data, and we are using Smart Settle, Dr. Ernest's brainchild, to measure the data and put up an alternative to these stakeholders, so that they engage in peace, not war. So please follow us in our future webinars. The one next coming up is with a historian, and it is very interesting to host Jack Leader. He's in Luxembourg now. He has been studying Myanmar history for decades. And please join us next Saturday, 10 a.m. Winnipeg time. And please follow us, track us, what we do in terms of peace in Myanmar. And on behalf of the Conflict and Resilience Research Institute, thank you, Michael, very much for being with us, enlightened us, and educated us on peace and peace building. Thank you. Take care. Bye bye.